Hi, in this video we will be rigging the character's torso, but let's start by looking at the finished product. First, we'll create a world control so that we can transform the entire character. Then a control for the whole torso, and then two individual controls, one for the hips and one for the chest. I will also create one control in the middle of the spine so we can adjust its shape. And lastly, I will layer a set of FK controls on top of the IK ones. So let's start from where we left everything in the last video. Right now things are a bit cluttered, so I will take all of the original bones and move them to the last bone layer. Then I will make them visible again. And then I will zoom in and try to select all of the spine bones and the pelvis bones, including the temp ones. And I will move those to a new layer. And now, as you can see, it's much easier to work with the bones that we need. Now let's add a new bone for the world control. Drag it up so it's a bit bigger, and then rotate it by -90 in X to align it with the world. Rename it to world control, and then duplicate it so that we can create a torso control. Snap its location to where the pelvis is, and let's scale it a bit down and rename it to torso control. And parent it to the world control. For now, there's nothing else to do with these controls, so let's give them custom shapes. Make a new collection and rename it to widget. And let's steal a piece of geometry from the sword to make the custom shape. I will grab an edge loop here. Make sure that the entire loop is selected. And then press Shift D to duplicate it. Then press P to separate it, switch to object mode and make this new geometry the active object. And snap its origin to geometry. Now we can reset its position, scale it up a bit, and rotate it so it sits on the ground. Ctrl A and apply all of its transforms. And let's rename it to widget world. Move it to the widget collection and unparent it from the armature. We can also hide the widget collection so it's not in the way. To assign this mesh as a custom shape, let's switch to the bone properties and then open up the viewport display. And in the search bar, type in the widget's name. Disable scale to bone size, and that's it. We can assign the same shape to the torso control and scale to fit. Now let's move on to the pelvis and chest. Rename the pelvis temp bone to pelvis control and spine 03 temp to chest control. And parent both of them to the torso control. Now let's make buffer bones for the original pelvis and spine 03. I will duplicate them, scale them down a bit, and rename them to buff pelvis and buff spine 03. Then parent the pelvis buffer bone to the pelvis control and the spine 03 buffer to the chest control. And now, after we constrain spine 03 to its buffer and pelvis to its buffer, they will inherit the motion from our controls. We can now give custom shapes to these two controls. The way I like to create custom shapes for bones that are not oriented to the world is to make a mesh and then constrain it to that bone. That makes it super easy to adjust the shape because it's already oriented to the bone. Assign the rig as the target, and then I search for the bone that I need. Now press the small X button to apply the transform to the object and delete the constraint. And now it's much easier to adjust the mesh because we already see what it would look like when assigned to the bone. I will speed this part up and then assign it to the bone the same way we did earlier. And I stopped the recording and did the same thing for the chest. And that takes care of the chest and pelvis, so let's rig the spine middle section next. Start by adding a new bone that spans between the start of the pelvis and start of the chest control. Next, recalculate its role by copying the one from the pelvis control and rename it to MCH spine driver. Now we can switch the display mode to B-bone, give the spine driver 15 subdivisions. Now in edit mode, let's adjust its curvature to align it with where the original spine bones are positioned. And assign the pelvis and chest controls as its handles. Now this changed the bone's shape a bit, so let's adjust the curvature again. Parent the spine driver to the pelvis control. Next, give it a stretch 2 constraint with the chest control as the target. And in the constraint settings, set the volume variation to 0. Next, let's start working on the spine control. Add a new bone anywhere, the position doesn't matter because we'll be constraining it. And give it a copy transforms constraint with the spine driver as a target. And with the B-bone toggle enabled, set the head tail value to 0.5. And now with this bone still selected, apply its pose as the rest pose. And you can rename this bone to buff spine control. I usually scale down my buffer bones, so I will do the same with this one. Then I will duplicate it to create the actual spine control. Rename the duplicate to spine control and parent it to the buffer. And it doesn't need the copy transforms constraint, so let's delete it. This bone will now follow the spine driver while maintaining the ability to animate it. I just paused the recording and gave it a custom shape. Now let's duplicate the spine driver, make it a bit thicker so it's easier to select, and give it 1 subdivision. Now snap the center of these 2 new bones to where the spine control is. Let's delete the stretch 2 constraint for now. And we can adjust the handle so that the first of these 2 bones has the spine control as the end handle, and the second bone has the spine control as the start handle. Rename the first one to MCH spine half lower, and the second one to MCH spine half upper. Let's parent spine half upper to the spine control. Next, let's make them stretchy. Add a stretch 2 constraint to the lower half with the spine control as the target, and the same to the upper half with the chest control as the target. And now in edit mode, let's adjust the curvature of these bones so that they match the spine driver's curvature. For both the upper and lower spine half, let's set volume variation to 0 in the stretch 2 constraint settings. And the next thing we will do is constrain the original spine bones to this setup. Now let's take the spine 01 temp bone and rename it to MCH spine 01 driver. And do the same with the spine 02 temp. Next, parent the MCH spine 02 driver to the spine upper half and MCH spine 01 to the lower half. And give it a copy transforms constraint with the lower spine half as the target. And then adjust the head-tail value so that the bone is positioned as close as possible to the original spine 01 bone. And then repeat the same process for MCH spine 02 driver. Now select both of these drivers and apply their position as the rest pose. Then duplicate both spine 01 and 02 to make some buffer bones. Rename them to buff spine 01 and buff spine 02. Parent buff spine 02 to the MCH driver spine 02 and the buff spine 01 to the MCH spine 01 driver. And then using a copy transforms constraint, constrain spine 02 to its buffer and spine 01 to its buffer. And now the whole spine should animate with our controls. And that is the whole IK setup, so let's move on to the FK setup. To create the first FK control, let's duplicate the pelvis control, scale it down a bit, and rename it to FK spine 01. Then duplicate the spine control, scale it down a bit, and rename it to FK spine 02. Then parent the second FK control to the first one. Make sure the first one is parented to the torso control, and then parent the chest control to the second FK control. And with the recording paused, I gave the FK controls some custom shapes. One last feature that I want to give the spine is the ability to disable stretching. Let me show you an easy way to do that. First, select the pelvis control and then shift select spine 01. Then give it a limit distance constraint. Then in this constraint settings, set the clamp region to on surface. Now repeat the same process with spine 01 and spine 02. And then the same again with spine 02 and spine 03. And what this does is it prevents the bones from changing the distance between them. Now I will create a driver that will allow us to enable or disable this feature. Let's select the torso control and give it a custom property. Let's edit this property and change its name to spine stretch. We don't need to change anything else. And now let's copy this value as a new driver. Select spine 01. And in the limit distance constraint, let's paste this driver on the influence property. Open up the edit driver menu, change the driver type to scripted expression, and in the expression field add 1- before what's already in there. Next, copy this driver and paste it on the other limit distance constraints. And let's test it to see if it works as expected. And finally, let's do some cleanup. Select all of the original spine bones and move them to the last layer where the rest of the original skeleton is. Then select all of the rig bones and while holding Alt, disable deform. Next, select all of the controls and move them to the first bone layer. Create a few bone groups and give them some colors. And after that, you can select the controls and assign them to these groups. And let's do one final check to see if everything works as expected. And lastly, if you learned anything from these videos and would like to see me make more, consider subscribing and maybe supporting me on one of the platforms listed here. Thank you for watching and see you in the next one.